2 words. That's all it took to send shockwaves through an entire national program. I quit. No microphone. No press conference. No official statement. Just 2 words reportedly spoken inside a closed Team USA training session in Puerto Rico. And within hours, the entire women's basketball world was on fire. Social media exploded. Analysts scrambled. Fans picked sides. And somehow, before anyone even confirmed what happened, the narrative had already split into 2 extremes. Either Caitlin Clark had melted down under pressure, or something much bigger had just snapped behind the scenes. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. Elite athletes don't just wake up and say, I quit. Not when they've fought for every inch of respect. Not when they've carried record-breaking ratings on their shoulders. Not when the 2028 Olympics are on home soil in Los Angeles. So if those words were spoken, and multiple insiders suggest they were, then this wasn't emotional. It was structural. Because what happened in that gym didn't begin in Puerto Rico. It began a year ago. And if you trace the pattern carefully, you start to see something that feels less like drama, and more like a slow collision between a generational superstar and an institution that may not know how to handle her. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's start where this really began. The breaking point didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one bad practice. It wasn't one heated exchange. And it definitely wasn't just one emotional reaction. This was a buildup. Rewind to 2024. When the Paris Olympic roster was announced, Caitlin Clark's name wasn't on it. At the time, the explanation sounded reasonable. She hadn't played a single WNBA game yet. She needed to prove herself at the professional level. USA Basketball emphasized experience, continuity, chemistry. They said it wasn't personal. And on the surface, that made sense. But here's what made it complicated. The roster was finalized before her rookie season even started. Before she had the chance to prove anything. Before she could demonstrate whether her college dominance would translate. She wasn't evaluated, she was pre-evaluated. And Clark didn't complain. She didn't take to social media. She didn't hint at frustration. She didn't throw subtle shots in interviews. Instead, she did the one thing that changes narratives faster than words ever could. She produced. And not just solid numbers. Historic numbers. She led the WNBA in assists as a rookie. She finished top 3 in scoring. She transformed a struggling Indiana Fever team from 13 wins to 24 in a single season. Attendance spiked everywhere she played. National ratings followed her schedule. This wasn't incremental growth. This was economic impact. This was cultural shift. Every arena she entered felt different. Every broadcast she appeared on drew eyes that hadn't been watching women's basketball before. She didn't just elevate a franchise, she shifted the gravity of the league. And she did it under pressure. Hard fouls, physical defense, veteran criticism, media scrutiny. Through all of it, she kept producing. So when the 2025 Team USA roster dropped, her inclusion felt inevitable. And it happened. Her name was finally there. But here's where something subtle stood out. The announcement didn't spotlight her. No feature headline. No marketing push centered around her return. No narrative framing of redemption. Just 12 names listed evenly. Clark's placed somewhere in the middle. For the most watched player in women's basketball. For the rookie who just carried ratings to historic levels. It felt restrained. One fan comment went viral within hours. She broke every record they asked for, and they still treat her like an afterthought. That comment gained tens of thousands of likes before the official roster post had even finished circulating. And that reaction tells you something important. The audience sees the imbalance. Now pause here for a second. USA Basketball has a long-standing culture. They value hierarchy. They value seniority. They reward veterans who've been through the system before. It's built on continuity, loyalty, and institutional trust. That model has worked for decades. But Clark isn't a typical rising star entering a traditional pipeline. She arrived with a national following already attached. She arrived with leverage most rookies don't have. She arrived as the face of a ratings boom. And that changes the dynamic. Because institutions are comfortable developing talent. They're less comfortable when talent shows up already powerful. From the outside, the roster inclusion looked like a victory. From a deeper lens, it felt conditional. You can join, but you don't control. You can participate, but you don't reshape. And if you've been paying attention, that tension has been present from the beginning. Clark didn't force her way in. She waited. She delivered. She elevated the league. And when she finally got the call, it didn't feel like the organization embracing her. It felt like the organization absorbing her. That distinction matters. Because when you absorb something powerful without adjusting the structure around it, friction builds. And friction, over time, turns into pressure. And pressure, if not released, eventually finds a crack. But the real shift didn't happen with the roster. It happened 3 days later, when the coaching staff was announced. And that's when people who had been quietly observing the pattern started connecting dots that suddenly didn't look random anymore. Because one specific name changed everything. And once that name appeared, the tension wasn't theoretical anymore. It became inevitable. 3 days after the roster announcement, the real story began. Because talent on paper is one thing. But the system placed above that talent, that's where power actually lives. When USA Basketball revealed the coaching staff for the Puerto Rico camp, the reaction wasn't explosive at first. It was quiet, analytical, subtle. Kara Lawson was named head coach. On paper, it looked solid. Former WNBA player. Respected basketball mind. Experience at the collegiate level with Duke. No immediate controversy. But when you dig beneath the resume and look at the on-court identity her Duke teams carried in the 2024 to 2025 season, a different picture starts forming. Duke was disciplined, structured, deliberate, but they were also one of the more offensively stagnant programs among elite teams. Spacing issues showed up repeatedly. Late-game possessions slowed to isolation sets. Ball movement tightened instead of flowing. Analysts publicly questioned why their offense seemed to compress under pressure instead of expand. That's not an insult. It's a philosophical identity. Control tempo. Protect structure. Value system over improvisation. Now pause. Look at the roster USA Basketball assembled. Caitlin Clark, Paige Buchers, Angel Reese, Chelsea Gray, Kelsey Plum. That's not a defensive grind roster. That's offensive volatility. That's spacing. That's transition play. That's pick-and-roll mastery. That's creativity. When you assemble that level of offensive firepower, the natural instinct is simple. Let them cook. But when the system is built around control and containment instead of expansion, something subtle happens. The ceiling lowers. Not because the players aren't capable, but because the structure doesn't allow full ignition. And that's where the tension began. Because Caitlin Clark is not a plug-and-play guard. She is rhythm-based. She thrives on pace changes, high pick-and-roll reads, off-ball relocation, quick trigger spacing. Her gravity warps defenses. But gravity only works if the system gives her room to bend it. A slowed-down, structured half-court scheme compresses that space. And then came the second announcement. The assistant coaching staff. That's when eyebrows truly went up. Stephanie White's name appeared. Now here's why that matters, and why this wasn't just another coaching appointment. Let's lay out the timeline. April 2024. Stephanie White serves as a court coach at a national training camp. She's between jobs at this point. October 2024. White becomes head coach of the Indiana Fever, Caitlin Clark's franchise. December 2024. White appears again at a USA Basketball event. March 2025. White is officially listed as assistant coach for the FIBA qualifying tournament in San Juan. 4 national team appearances. All within Clark's professional orbit. In less than a year. Now, think about what elite athletes typically need after a grueling season. They need contrast. A new voice. A different offensive language. A reset environment that challenges them in unfamiliar ways. Growth at the highest level doesn't come from repetition. It comes from friction against something new. Clark spent an entire WNBA season inside White's system. Every practice. Every film session. Every late-game decision. Every adjustment. And then when the season ended, instead of entering a fresh national structure, the same voice followed her. Same philosophy. Same pacing tendencies. Same hierarchy preferences. That's not development. That's extension. And extension can feel suffocating when you're trying to evolve. Now let's talk about something even more delicate. Hierarchy. Stephanie White's Indiana rotations leaned toward veteran-initiated sets in critical moments. That's not controversial. That's documented. Late in close games, possessions often shifted toward established veterans handling initiation, even when Clark was the statistical engine. That choice communicates something subtle. Trust is earned over time. But here's the complication. Clark wasn't producing like a typical rookie. She was producing like a primary option. When production outpaces seniority, institutions face a choice: adjust the hierarchy or protect it. USA basketball has historically protected it. Veterans who've been through Olympic cycles carry institutional capital. They understand the culture. They've earned political trust within the system. Clark entered that environment not just as a rookie, but as the most visible player in the sport. That visibility changes power dynamics, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. If she thrives freely, she becomes the face of the program. If she operates within a controlled role, the institution remains the centerpiece. And here's where things get even more layered. If Clark struggles inside a restrictive system, the blame doesn't fall on structure. It falls on her. She needs to adjust. She's still learning. She's not there yet. The system stays insulated. That's the trap. And players at her level understand that trap. Because by the time you're leading a league in assists as a rookie, you're not just playing basketball. You're reading environments. You're identifying patterns. You're recognizing when something doesn't align. So when fans reacted to Stephanie White's inclusion, it wasn't random outrage. It was pattern recognition. Clark didn't get the Olympic nod. She was told to prove herself. She did, historically. She was added to the roster quietly. Then the coaching structure placed above her mirrored the one that had already limited certain aspects of her late-game usage. For some observers, that wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. And continuity can feel stabilizing. Or it can feel like containment. But the real evidence that this tension wasn't imagined? It's in the numbers. Because beneath the highlight reels and assist totals, there was a subtle trend developing. One that made the Puerto Rico concerns feel less emotional and more calculated. And once you look at those numbers closely, you understand why that team meeting didn't come out of nowhere. It was building. And what the stats revealed is something very few people wanted to confront publicly. The stats looked perfect on the surface. 19 points per game. Over 8 assists. Nearly 6 rebounds. League leader in playmaking as a rookie. Those aren't good for a first-year player numbers. Those are franchise centerpiece numbers. But when analysts started digging deeper into the film, something subtle appeared. And subtle trends are often the most dangerous ones, because they don't scream. They whisper. Tracking data from several close Indiana Fever games revealed a shift in Clark's involvement during high-leverage moments. Her overall usage rate was elite. But in fourth quarters of tight games, particularly in playoff scenarios, her shot attempts dipped. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just enough to raise eyebrows among people who were paying attention. Now here's where it becomes important. Basketball isn't just about who scores the most. It's about who controls the final possessions when the margin shrinks. Stars aren't defined by box scores. They're defined by who the system turns to when everything is on the line. And there was one playoff moment that analysts kept returning to. Game 2. Indiana versus Connecticut. First round. 3 minutes left. Fever down 4. Clark already had 22 points. She was in rhythm. The defense was stretched thin trying to contain her range. And then something shifted. The ball stopped finding her. Possessions initiated elsewhere. Sets slowed down. The pace tightened. Indiana lost. They lost the series. And that sequence became a quiet case study. Not because Clark demanded the ball. Not because she publicly criticized anything. But because elite players understand when momentum is redirected. And fans understand it too. After that game, conversations started surfacing online. Why did the offense drift away from its most dynamic threat? Why did the system tighten instead of expand? Why did the structure protect itself instead of leaning into its hottest weapon? Those questions never received explosive headlines. They didn't trend for weeks. But they stayed in basketball circles. Because they weren't emotional questions. They were tactical ones. Now bring that lens into Puerto Rico. Team USA camp wasn't just a ceremonial gathering. It was the first real audition for the 2026 FIBA World Cup cycle. Minutes here matter. Role definition here matters. Perception here matters. And perception in USA basketball travels upward. If a player is seen thriving inside the system, she gains institutional trust. If she appears out of rhythm or reduced, that narrative sticks. Now imagine being Clark walking into that environment. You just proved yourself statistically. You carried ratings. You elevated a franchise. But you also experienced late-game possessions drifting away from you in critical moments. Then you arrive at national camp and see overlapping coaching philosophy. Same pacing tendencies. Same structured half-court emphasis. Same hierarchy culture. It's not paranoia at that point. It's pattern awareness. And this is where context becomes everything. Clark's strength isn't just shooting. It's gravity. When she runs high pick and roll, defenses collapse. When she relocates off ball, defenders hesitate. When she pushes tempo, the floor stretches. But if the system reduces pick and roll frequency, if off-ball movement becomes scripted instead of reactive, if tempo is controlled rather than unleashed, her impact compresses, not because she declines, but because the environment narrows. And here's the dangerous part. When an explosive player looks slightly muted, critics don't analyze the scheme. They analyze the player. She's struggling. She hasn't adjusted. She's not ready for this level. That's how narratives form. System stays intact. Player absorbs the pressure. And that's the risk Clark was staring at. Because once a narrative attaches at the national level, it doesn't fade easily. Especially heading toward Olympic cycles. Now add one more layer. USA basketball traditionally rewards continuity. Chelsea Gray, Kelsey Plum, established veterans with gold medals. They've built institutional trust over years. Clark's dominance is recent. Historic, but recent. So if the offense flows through veterans during high-leverage moments at camp, if Clark's role subtly shifts off ball, if her touches decrease in structured sets, the perception won't be, the system is limiting her. It will be she's still learning. That's the tightrope. And this is why the usage conversation matters. Because by the time Puerto Rico arrived, Clark wasn't just evaluating plays. She was evaluating trajectory. Is this camp expanding my game? Or repeating patterns? Is this environment elevating me? Or conditioning me to fit? Elite competitors don't fear accountability. But they do recognize when ceilings are quietly installed above them. And once you recognize that ceiling, you either accept it, or you question it. And according to multiple insiders, she questioned it. Which brings us to the meeting. Because tension doesn't explode randomly. It builds in silence first. Film sessions, walkthroughs, controlled scrimmages, playbook installs, and then eventually someone speaks up. And when that happened inside that Puerto Rico facility, everything changed. Because what was said wasn't dramatic. It was direct. And direct honesty inside structured institutions often feels like rebellion. This is where the story stops being statistical and starts becoming personal. It didn't happen during a game. It didn't happen in front of cameras. It happened in a meeting room. No crowd noise. No social media. Just players, coaches, and a whiteboard. By the time Team USA settled into camp in Puerto Rico, the offensive framework had already been introduced. Sets were being installed. Terminology reinforced. Spacing assignments clarified. Tempo emphasized. And from multiple accounts circulating around the program, one theme kept surfacing quietly. Control the pace. Protect structure. Limit risk. Again, that philosophy isn't wrong. It's safe. But safety and explosiveness rarely live in the same space. According to insiders, Clark didn't erupt. She didn't slam a chair. She didn't call anyone out personally. She asked a basketball question. Why are we limiting high pick-and-roll volume with guards who thrive there? Why is off-ball movement being scripted instead of reactive? Why are we slowing tempo when this roster can outrun almost anyone? Those aren't emotional questions. They're tactical ones. And in elite environments, tactical questions can feel threatening if they challenge the installed blueprint. Reports suggest Cara Lawson responded firmly. The system was in place for a reason. International play demands discipline. Turnovers get punished. Structure wins tournaments. Again, not unreasonable. But here's where temperature shifts. Clark's game is built on calculated risk. Deep-range attempts. Split-second reads. Fast decisions under defensive pressure. You can't remove volatility from her style without removing what makes her dangerous. The exchange reportedly grew sharper. Not disrespectful. Just intense. Two strong basketball minds pulling from different philosophies. Players in the room felt the tension. You can sense those moments even when voices aren't raised. It's in posture. It's in silence. It's in who speaks next and who doesn't. And sometime after that meeting ended, the phrase started circulating. I quit. Now here's the important distinction. There was no official confirmation she declared withdrawal from the program. No press statement followed. No agent announcement. But multiple whispers from inside camp described Clark expressing frustration to teammates afterward. Frustration strong enough that she considered stepping away. And that's where interpretation took over. Did she mean quitting the camp? Quitting the conversation? Quitting the idea of fighting the structure? Or was it a moment of emotional exhaustion after weeks of internal tension? Inside controlled institutions, even a hypothetical statement can spread like wildfire. By the next morning, the energy in the gym reportedly felt different. Clark showed up. She practiced. But observers described a visible shift. Quieter, more reserved, less communicative during breaks. Again, nothing dramatic in isolation. But in context, everything felt magnified. Clips from open practice leaked online. Clark standing slightly apart during water breaks. Clark leaving the floor without extended conversation. Ordinary moments, but layered with narrative weight. And when narrative weight attaches to body language, people start projecting. Was she checked out? Was she recalibrating? Was she realizing the fight wasn't worth it? Or was she calculating something bigger? Because here's what most people misunderstand about elite competitors. They don't quit easily. They pivot. If Clark truly felt the system could limit her trajectory toward 2026 and 2028, walking away emotionally in the moment would be one reaction. Staying and adjusting strategically would be another. And here's what's undeniable. She didn't leave Puerto Rico. She didn't officially withdraw. She stayed. Which makes those two words even more interesting. Because if this were a meltdown, it would have escalated. Instead, it stabilized. That suggests something different. Not emotional collapse. Strategic awareness. And here's where the stakes expand far beyond one training camp. Puerto Rico isn't just a qualifying stop. It's perception building. Minutes here influence future role definition. Performance here shapes selection committees, subconscious impressions. And the biggest shadow looming over this entire situation? Los Angeles. Home soil. The most commercially powerful Olympic cycle women's basketball has ever seen. If Clark enters that runway muted inside the system, her influence shrinks institutionally. If she enters it unleashed, she becomes the centerpiece of the entire Olympic narrative. That's not just basketball. That's power. And power shifts are rarely smooth inside long-standing structures. The real tension inside that meeting wasn't about one offensive set. It was about identity. Is Team USA willing to evolve around a generational force? Or does the generational force have to compress herself to fit tradition? That's the question sitting underneath everything. And here's the part that makes this even more delicate. If Clark underperforms in this camp, critics won't dissect scheme complexity. They'll question her readiness. If she thrives despite limitations, the narrative becomes impossible to contain. So when those two words reportedly escaped that room, they weren't about quitting basketball. They were about confronting a crossroads. Fight the structure, or flow within it. But this story doesn't end in that meeting room. Because once you zoom out, you realize Puerto Rico is just the first chess move. And what happens next could shape the entire next Olympic cycle. San Juan was never just about qualifying. That's the public version. Win games. Secure positioning. Move on. But internally, every minute on that floor is data collection. Who initiates late-game sets? Who closes tight matchups? Who the staff trusts when momentum swings? Those impressions don't disappear after one tournament. They follow players into the next cycle. And the next cycle is everything. Because the next cycle ends in Los Angeles. Home soil. Primetime American coverage. Record-breaking sponsorship exposure. This isn't just another Olympic year. It's the most commercially powerful Olympic runway women's basketball has ever had. And Caitlin Clark sits at the center of that gravity, whether the institution publicly frames it that way or not. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. USA Basketball has always operated on internal loyalty. Veterans build equity over time. Olympic gold medals reinforce trust. Institutional relationships matter. Chelsea Gray, Kelsey Plum, players who've navigated international systems before. They've earned capital inside the structure. Clark's capital is different. It's external. Ratings, audience growth, merchandise spikes, broadcast leverage. That kind of influence doesn't flow through traditional channels. It arrives with pressure attached. And institutions that are built on tradition don't automatically pivot around external power. They absorb it carefully, sometimes cautiously, sometimes defensively. Here's the real question that lingers behind all of this. Is Team USA building its future around Clark, or asking Clark to quietly adapt to its past? Because those are two very different philosophies. If the system evolves around her strengths, the offense opens. Tempo expands. The brand aligns with the most watched style in women's basketball. If she adapts into a controlled secondary role, the structure remains intact, but her ceiling inside the program tightens. And make no mistake, Clark understands ceiling dynamics. She's navigated them her entire career. At Iowa, she didn't shrink into a traditional guard mold. She bent the mold. Now she's inside an institution that historically doesn't bend easily. That's not villainous. It's just institutional reality. But here's why Puerto Rico mattered so much. If she dominates inside this system, she forces adaptation. If she looks restricted, critics won't blame scheme design. They'll say international play exposed her. That narrative can linger. And narratives become self-fulfilling in Olympic selection rooms. This is where the stakes become crystal clear. Clark isn't fighting for a camp rotation. She's protecting her Olympic trajectory. Because once perception shifts, reclaiming it becomes harder than maintaining it. Now look at it from the organization's perspective. They don't want chaos. They don't want internal disruption. They don't want headlines suggesting conflict. Stability wins tournaments, but innovation grows audiences. And that's the friction point. For decades, Team USA didn't need to evolve offensively to maintain dominance. They were deeper, more physical, more experienced. But women's basketball globally is changing. Spacing is expanding. Range is extending. Tempo is accelerating. Clark represents that new wave. Deep pull-ups, rapid decision-making, high-risk, high-reward reads. That style draws fans. It also introduces volatility. Institutions prefer predictability. Audiences prefer electricity. Balancing those two forces is delicate. And when you put the most electrifying player in the sport inside a structure built on predictability, tension isn't surprising. It's mathematical. Now think back to those two words. I quit. If they were said, they weren't about exhaustion. They were about collision. Collision between philosophy and identity. Collision between hierarchy and momentum. Collision between legacy structure and generational force. But here's the part that matters most. She didn't leave. She stayed. That decision speaks louder than any leaked phrase. Because staying means calculation. Staying means she understands the long game. You don't abandon Olympic cycles over one heated meeting. You gather information. You adjust. You wait for moments to expand your leverage. Clark's leverage isn't inside meeting rooms. It's on the floor. If she lights up international competition, no structure can mute that. If she commands tempo regardless of scheme, the narrative shifts automatically. And that's what makes the next stretch so important. Because performance solves politics faster than debate ever could. Now zoom out one more level. Women's basketball is entering its most visible era. Media rights deals are growing. College viewership already exploded. WNBA expansion is accelerating. The Olympic stage in 2028 could be the single biggest spotlight the sport has ever experienced. Who becomes the face of that moment matters. And if the most watched player in the game feels friction inside the national program, that tension doesn't disappear quietly. It either resolves through evolution, or it lingers through limitation. That's why Puerto Rico wasn't small. It was symbolic. Symbolic of whether the institution adapts to the wave, or tries to contain it. And here's the twist nobody can ignore. If Clark thrives within the system, the organization wins. If she thrives despite the system, she wins. If she struggles inside it, the debate intensifies. Every outcome reshapes something. Which means the real story was never about quitting. It was about positioning. And positioning takes patience. Those two words ignited headlines. But they didn't end anything. They exposed tension that had been quietly building for a year. Olympic snub. Historic rookie response. Muted roster announcement. Coaching overlap. Usage patterns. Philosophical differences. Piece by piece, the pressure accumulated. Puerto Rico just revealed it. The real question now isn't whether she said, "I quit." It's whether Team USA recognizes what it has in front of it. Because audiences didn't flood arenas for system structure. They came for transformation. They came for range that bends defenses. They came for creativity that feels different. And right now, the most watched player in women's basketball is navigating the most delicate stretch of her early career. Not against opponents. Against architecture. The next performances will speak louder than any meeting ever could. And if you think this story is over, it's not. The tournament continues. Rotations will tighten. Minutes will tell the truth. And every possession from here forward carries Olympic implications. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because we're tracking every shift, every adjustment, and every development as this unfolds. The pattern isn't finished yet. And what happens next could redefine the future of Team USA women's basketball.